Now going on to two keynote presentations. Keynote, first of all, Dr. Seita EMORI from National Institute for Environmental Studies, Deepening Climate Crisis. Dr. EMORI is an expert of future estimate and risk studies of global warming. He is also one of the authors of IPCC-AR, the assessment report. This year again, Japan has suffered from abnormal high temperature and typhoons. There were lots of damages, but all over the world, there are out of control wildfires, mountain fires, bushfires, and the flood. The temperature rise from before the Industrial Revolution is on average in the world 1 degrees. By 2019, there was a rise of 1.1 degrees Celsius. And already with this rise of 1 degrees, already there are damages and changes that are physically visible and palpable to all of us. So he will tell us about the state and the risk of climate change. Dr. EMORI.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the introduction. My name is EMORI. Thank you very much for this great opportunity. I do climate change future forecasts. Today, the topic is deepening climate crisis. How should we recognize climate crisis? And I would also like to show you what my views are on how to respond to this crisis. Let me share my slides with you. Deepening Climate Crisis is the title of the presentation. First, this is just to confirm global mean surface temperature has been rising, as can be seen from this graph. This tracks from 1950 until recent years. Over the short term, there's variation from around 2000. Some people said that the global warming had stopped, but over the long term, it's rising. And as you know, as a result of human activity, CO2 in atmosphere is going up. This kind of rise cannot be explained otherwise. And this year, a record high in temperature is being observed. In September, it was a record high. Especially the average temperature in September was such a record. In Death Valley, highest ever temperature was recorded. Or even in Japan, this is Hamamatsu, 41.1 degrees. It's a record temperature. So record highs in temperatures or torrential rain. These incidents are increasing, and extreme weather events, depending on the changes in atmospheric pressure, it happens, but on average, temperature is rising, and as a result, we see these record heat, record rain, precipitation. We are witnessing these events in the recent past, as you know. These are some pictures that I show always. Climate simulation to take a look at the changes in temperature. The top graph is without any measures. The bottom one is measures to stay below 2 degrees, starting from 1985. And this is still in the past, so red appears and it varies from the Arctic area, start to turn red, as you can see. And in 2020 and beyond, by 2030 or 2040, until about that time, the overall darkness of the red color doesn't change between the top graph and the bottom one, but in 2050s and 2060s, the difference is clear. One with no measures and one is to take measures to stay below 2 degrees. The bottom map, global warming had stopped, but the top map, global warming is continuing. Arctic Sea, ice is melting, and the temperature is rising, as you can see from the color. One thing I would like you to notice is that if temperature goes up by 4 degrees, on average, some places will have even more increases. For example, in high latitude areas, it's not just going to be 4 degrees. It could go up by 5, 6, 7, or 8 degrees. So this is something that we need you to recognize. Now, a tipping point. or a point of no return. These terms are sometimes discussed. If you go beyond a certain point, it is going to be irreversible. A sudden dramatic change could take place. And sometimes we see reports that we have already gone past that tipping point, which is quite shocking. Recently, Greenland's ice sheet has melted to a point of no return, according to an article carried by CNN, which was quite striking. And I went to see some literature. But shortly, I saw this explanation from Climate Feedback. Experts' commentary is provided. And if you read the literature, this wasn't a point of no return. That was the conclusion. Ice sheet in Greenland, outflow of such ice sheet, there has been some disruptive increase in the amount of flow, but this doesn't mean that the inland ice sheet, the melting, will continue without any limits. We're not there yet. We're not at a point of no return yet. It's not too late now. So we are confident that we are not there yet. It's not too late. But if we haven't crossed the point of no return, can we rest assured? No, that's not the case. What we have to be worried about is obviously gradual enhancement of extreme weather events, torrential rain and heat waves causing health damage. This is likely to go up in number, and the most serious is Arctic region, dry regions, low-lying coastal areas, and island nations, vulnerable people, indigenous people, poor people. They haven't generated so much CO2 themselves, but they could stand to suffer greatly from climate change. This is quite unfair. So we have to be cognizant of this fact. And there could be irreversible loss of ecosystem. And as I said, Greenland ice sheet. We haven't gone to the point of no return yet, but as we approach towards 1.5 to 2 degrees, there is the risk of destabilization, and eventually we'll cross that line. And that is something that we have to be worried about. Now, let me talk about the impact of COVID-19. I'm sure that you are aware of this already. This year, stay home as a countermeasure against COVID-19, economic activity was restrained, and as a result, CO2 emissions declined. This graph shows the peak time in early April. Let me blow this up. From February, China, there was a peak starting from China, and this spread to Europe and the Americas, and in April and May, there has a major decline. And the biggest factor is land transport, vehicle transport was reduced. At peak time, it was down 17% year on year. And after that, there has been recoveries, so it's now down by 4 to 7%. On average, throughout the year. Now, this 7% decline year on year, if every year, if we are going to reduce CO2 emissions by 7%, we could aim at 1.5 degrees. That is the pace. But if you just take a single year, and if we go back to where we were before, then let us look at CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. Let me blow this up. If you look closely, there's a red line and a blue line, and the red and the blue are not so different. There's just a slight decline. So if this decline is just for a single year, then in terms of atmospheric CO2 concentration, the impact is quite negligible. And obviously, the impact on temperature rise is also negligible. And therefore, we need to see continued reduction of emissions. So green recovery, build back better are being advocated for that reason. And as was discussed, this year happens to have economic stagnation pushing down emissions. We need to try to reduce emissions through a different way. This is the global energy transition. Right now, oil, coal, natural gas, accounting for 80% to generate energy, and oil and natural gas are still increasing because the demand is growing. This is how it looks today, but with renewable energy growing at an accelerated rate, we could try to increase this at this pace so that eventually this could replace all fossil fuels. That is what we need to aim at. This, I'm sure, you're all aware of. So when we think about this, one research outcome, let me just cite this research outcome. Carbon infrastructure lock-in is a notion that is discussed. The conclusion is that around the world, there is no further room for building new thermal power production, power plants and cars that are continue to be used with their usable life. There is the possibility that CO2 emissions would be more than 1.5 degrees. So we cannot have any thermal power plants anymore, or the existing ones should be closed down and decommissioned earlier than the period of life. And we also need to capture and have CO2 sinks from the atmosphere. Otherwise, we cannot aim to contain the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. We're nearing our limit. Well, this is quite gloomy, this news. But as Morisawa-san discussed at the outset, in Japan, there's so much renewable energy potential here in Japan. This is current. For example, just with electricity, about double the size of electricity demand, even after accounting for economy. We do have that potential. Most of it comes from wind power, offshore wind. This needs to be developed in a full-fledged scale, and this work has already been started. But there are challenges: cost reduction, grid connection, flexibility, uncontrolled development. These are some of the issues that we have to work on to try to expand renewable energy in Japan, and the work is already started. We need to maximize these efforts. For Japan, something encouraging can be seen. This is a citing from a certain research. If the world, well, today, the world is dependent on fossil fuels, but if around the world, every country would go decarbonized, if they make a transition to decarbonized world, whether Japan would stand to gain or lose. Well, this is a comparative analysis between countries. Which country would benefit? Well, Japan is in pink. The conclusion here is that Japan would be a winner. Japan stands to benefit from decarbonization because currently Japan, about 20 trillion yen is paid by Japan to import fossil fuels. But if we go RE100, we don't have to pay that much. And we can source our energy domestically. And if there's going to be a major transition, there could be some concern of disorder. But Japan has a good order in society, so we could stand to benefit. So given the national interest of Japan, we should promote decarbonization across the globe with all of our force. So let me wrap up. In comparison to COVID-19, this is something that I use when I'm talking to citizens. What we can do and exit from crisis. In the case of COVID-19, we can wear a mask or wash our hands and have social distancing. That is effective in not infecting elderly people and not inundating hospitals. But eventually we may have vaccines or therapeutics, or collective immunity could be gained, so that we can move towards the exit. So COVID-19 would be a disease that will be only as scary as the common influenza. In the case of climate crisis, each one of us, what we can do would be to switch off or try to conserve energy to try to reduce CO2. Well, that may be the notion that many people have. When we look at the exit, we need to decarbonize our society. We have no time to lose. Each one of us must be aware of decarbonization, to learn about this and disseminate information about this, to let others know about the importance. Lastly, decarbonization and COVID-19. When we think of these two challenges at the same time, for the humankind, there's a number of issues that is in the background. Human activities which pursue endless material expansion, ecosystem encroachment by human activities, reproduction of social inequality, imperfect international cooperation. We need to be heading for the exit and think about decarbonization. This is a major topic, and I don't think I can cover them all. But when you have a big challenge like this, people may have different opinions, but we need to decarbonize with all our force. This is something that I'm sure everyone can agree on and move forward with all our might. That is all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Emori. So we have not gone beyond the tipping point, but the temperature rise, we must keep it no higher than 1.5 in order to reach 2030 or 2050. It is up to what we do now in 2020 to utilize the abundant renewable energy in the local regions. What we can do in the coming decade is the key. Because of this pandemic in 2020 at this milestone, not only the short-term economic recovery, but how to change the social system. Those are the questions. So where is Japan standing in front of this massive target? The second keynote is a representative of JCI, Mr. Takejiro Seiyoshi, Japan's challenge to decarbonization. Mr. Seiyoshi. Once again, good afternoon. I am Seiyoshi, representative of JCI. Through the web, there is a large number of participants across the world. Thank you very much indeed. Today, I will talk about Japan's challenges to move towards decarbonization. The world is transforming. What is important is to understand the movement of the world, to have a bird's eye view, to feel the world is important. And this is what I feel about the changing world right now. Decarbonization, it could be a monster that is starting to be violent across the world. There is a tectonic transformation, tectonic budge occurring in the businesses despite this tectonic movement. The sense of crisis is absent here in Japan. There is a huge gap. So I personally do have a big concern about the lack of sense of crisis in Japan despite changes in that time. Across the world, a business portfolio transformation, unprecedented, is occurring. Well, to use a nice word, maybe uncharted business transformation. I was surprised some years ago, 2016, about 4 years ago, the German #1 energy company and #2 energy company, they divided their companies into half. The traditional generation part and the new business part. The #1 E.ON back then and RVE, the second back then, they split their company. That is to catch up with energy transformation from 1st of January 2016. And when this was discussed, at the latest 2015 or back in 2014, the two big entities must have been discussing already. So the #1 and #2, the two top German companies back in 2014 also, they had already started to talk about separating. Last month, September 28, that reputable company Siemens, they also split their company. The traditional plus non-traditional wind is the renewable, they spun off and IPO'd Siemens Energy. when I talk about these examples, what I always say is these corporate efforts, in particular, the determination of the CEO, what has to be done is decided. The capacity to make judgment and execute these capacities of the CEOs. I express my respect to the CEOs' difficult judgments, and plus the German economy and the society and the climate that accept these major changes. I envy this atmosphere. And on the last day of August, I was genuinely surprised that companies on the New York Stock Exchange, the Dow Industrial Average out of 30, that ExxonMobil was kicked out of Dow Average. You know about this. ExxonMobil, what organization is this? It has been the leader of a century in the U.S. capital market, and it has now been struck out of the Dow list. And not only that, even 2 years before ExxonMobil, in June 2018, that GE, that was struck out, kicked out of the Dow Industrial. Back at school, you learned about Edison in your textbook. It was Edison who made GE the symbol of American industry, American capitalism, and these two giants of the U.S., quite easily they are kicked out of Dow Industrial Average. So in this way, the capital market is cold, calm, insightful towards the future, and the Japanese enterprises are also living in this environment. And the oil companies, these two British entities, including BP and Royal Dutch Shell, ever since their foundation, they have started the major transformation. No longer are they an oil company, they call themselves energy company. And under the pandemic, revenue declining, they are suffering bleeding and deficit. But despite that, between April and June, both have recognized 2 trillion yen worth of impairment losses. So stranded assets will be disposed. That is the determination of these British entities. Why? It's because of the energy transformation across the world. So the decarbonization demand, this is going to be unstoppable move, and it already has started. At the beginning of this year, I was surprised about Microsoft's announcement. Even an ordinary company like this, it's difficult to go CO2 neutral, but Microsoft going beyond zero, they said they would be CO2 minus. Even the historical emission, they are going to offset their past emissions. I was surprised, but then by September, it was Google this time. They said that they have already offset all they had emitted in the past. The entire footprint by Google is already zero, is what they announced. Why big businesses working like this? Because they are rich? I do not think that is the reason. Unless these actions are taken, the business foundation will be eroded. No matter how capable businesses are, they will go nowhere. This is the urgent sense of crisis, and there is a sense that this is natural to do. A social, entrepreneurial enterprise culture is being generated, and I am surprised at this change in the environment. And corporate CEOs to go carbon neutral, it's not only about their own entity, the upstream and the downstreams of supply chains. It's greenwashing if you only think about your own business. So targeting net zero by all, this is a big kind of net over the entire industry. So no entity can be free or immune from this carbon footprint zero network, whether it's Apple or Unilever, including the supply chain-wide emission. To target net zero, supply chain-wide, not only yourself. And of course, Japanese companies are also covered by this network. If Japanese companies cannot go net zero, they cannot do business with Apple or Unilever. So this, I think, is the emergence of new business rules. Because I was in the financial industry, finally, I would say that the real conservatives have also started to change and take action. For example, I am also involved in UNEP-FI, the UNEP Financial Initiative. Just 1 year ago in September at the United Nations General Assembly, Principles for Responsible Banking was established. So far, there were such principles for insurance and investment, and finally for banking was adopted. The largest characteristic of PRB is shown in principle number 1, that to put it very simply, when bank finance businesses, it must be in alignment with the personal and social goal under SDGs and Paris Agreement. In other words, if it is not in alignment with SDGs or Paris Agreement, banks are responsible entities and cannot finance or offer loans. So this is effectively what has been declared. At a very fundamental level, what has been clarified is by BlackRock. As you know, BlackRock is the largest investment institution in the world. The asset under management, $7 trillion, far larger than Japan's GDP. And Larry Fink, the CEO, in his letter to the CEOs, what did he write? A fundamental reshaping of finance was the language that he used. Finance is being reshaped fundamentally. Fundamental means capital flow will change. And the Japanese financial industry, I wonder if they really understand the profound meaning. As I have been in the financial industry in New York along, the core conservative, after all, is Morgan Stanley in the US. I did work very hard, but finally, even Morgan Stanley has started to say something like this. This is Morgan Stanley saying this. And therefore, it's not only New York, but the financial hubs across the world are now changing their gravity. What this means is, from a macro perspective, the economic model, how the economy ought to be, how capitalism ought to be, that itself is under review. 1 year ago, as you recall, the American Business Roundtable announced that the responsibility of the CEO is not only shareholders, but it is society number one. All the stakeholders, including workers, communities, and shareholders. And the professor of Oxford University mentioned about the start of revision of shareholder capitalism. I mentioned about tectonic changes in France, as you know. Enterprise at Mission. They are starting to support this by legislation. What is enterprise who executes mission? Not only pursuing profit, but to be accountable for social responsibility, be kind to the environment, and that must be explicitly mentioned in articles of incorporation. And Danone became number one to announce that. I observe these corporate activities across the world, and companies who ought to pursue profit are now going to become more public in the nature. For example, Google issued a sustainability bond, and surprisingly, affordable housing is one of the purpose of this financing. At an affordable price, ordinary people should be able to access housing. But why Google doing affordable housing? And same with Amazon. And so not only looking at their own business, but companies are now starting to think about the entire society by contributing with their business. This is the technological change. So the so-called asset owners who manage pension funds, sustainability is now the core pillar and important perspective in their investment decision. And this is observed in surveys and questionnaires. And because of this background, zero emission is not limited to business and industry. It is related to the whole nation. Zero emission, I think, is now becoming national strategies. In the case of Europe, needless to talk about this, European Green Deal, that they are becoming the world's first continent to go carbon neutral. the European Climate Act bill. The deliberation is near ending. What I am focusing on is the border carbon adjustment. I am interested in this because carbon pricing, countries, if they are not paying carbon pricing, imported from such countries, it must make a level playing field, so there will be an adjustment tax. Even such a discussion is taking place. U.S. is right in the middle of presidential election, and Mr. Biden, he is likely leading in the campaign. If Biden becomes the president, at the federal level, the American policy will go through a dramatic change, but at the state level, they are far ahead of Japan. China, President Xi Jinping just sent out his message by video at the UN. So to go carbon neutral by 26, and the 10 billion tons or so emission per year, that they will peak out by 2030 within 10 years or so. On the other hand, in the case of Japan, what is happening? So the zero emission, this is some of the national goals. The European Parliament just the other day announced, Ms. von der Leyen mentioned about 55% reduction, that it will be made more ambitious to 60% reduction. What will the European Commission do? So by introducing the other countries, and then this is about Japan, some historical background. So today, the Japanese government has started to revise the basic plan under the current Japanese basic plan. Back then, in July 2015, how many years back was that? July 2015, this was decided. And then the data based on which year? Normally, that would be around 2014, 2013 data. But when changes are occurring, the data used is from 5 or 6 years ago. The Japanese government is going backwards. They are not only frozen, fossilized, but they are moving backwards. As a result, out of the power consumption, and these are the energy mix, and renewable ratio in Japan is as low as this. If this is the situation, then what I expect of Japan is, as Dr. Emori just discussed, after all, climate change is about science, and therefore, based on science and data, to the climate crisis, a correct sense of crisis must be shared. Without the sense of crisis, goals cannot be shared with the world, or people will not be able to understand the policies advocated by people who does have correct understanding of the crisis. What I want to tell Japan, please quickly accept net zero. Be resolute, because with the thoughts and strategy of a low carbon target era, you cannot be a winner in the 21st century. Japan will be a loser. The decarbonization competition should be a whole-of-nation battle with the goal of net zero. Unless Japan battles as a country, all the potential of Japan must be utilized. Otherwise, Japan cannot win. In order to realize all the Japanese potential, no ordinary goal is stimulative enough. Very high, ambitious hurdle is required. That is what the national government should advocate. Without a goal of net zero, Japan cannot even participate in this global competition. Net zero is the global goal. If Japan does not share that goal, no one will listen to or trust what Japan says. Therefore, because the government of Japan is talking about reviewing the basic plan and the NDC to raise to 45% reduction, or about the renewable share by fiscal 2030 to raise it to 45%, I sincerely hope that there will be more ambitious plans by the central government. Finally, recent movements about JCI. We shall hear about raise to zero right afterwards, but JCI is going to participate in race to zero and work hard. Just the other day, we sent out the message. Within 2 years or so, our membership has gone beyond 500. it has gone to 505 or 506, an increase that is occurring every week. We want to understand why our membership is expanding. So finally, it is our real stage opportunity to be on the stage. CNN often mentions change can happen. Thank you for your attention.
はい、非常に日本の現実について
Thank you very much. About the realities of Japan in comparison with the overseas situation, it was very thought-provoking. Based on science, we have to have the correct sense of crisis. Do we have that correct sense of crisis? What are the challenges for Japan and the world? The two keynote speakers gave us those questions. With these questions in mind, let us hear from Japanese actors in the following panel sessions. But before that, we have guests from respective ministries and agencies. First, State Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry, Mr. Kiyoshi Ejima. Hello, everyone. My name is Kiyoshi Ejima, State Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry. Let me offer my congratulations to this online Japan Climate Action Summit, convening those who are actively working on climate change response. The COVID-19 pandemic is having a great impact on our daily lives and our economic activity. The world CO2 emission volumes clearly show that impact. This past April, the IEA announced its forecast that in 2020, world CO2 emissions will be down 8% year-on-year. And this drop of 8% gathered attention because it is equivalent to the target of limiting temperature rises to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The target to prevent global warming is as big a challenge as the magnitude of the damage on the economy caused by COVID-19. But it is not realistic to continue with this level of CO2 emission reductions while sacrificing economic activity. Therefore, what we need now is disruptive innovation that allows us to recover from COVID and at the same time reduce CO2 emissions. The Japanese government regards climate change response not as a constraint, but as an opportunity, as we advocated last year at G20 meeting under the policy of realizing a virtuous cycle of environment and growth. We're boldly working on climate change countermeasures. In the progressive environment innovation strategy that was developed in this past January, we decided to aim at establishing innovative technologies to realize beyond zero that would reduce CO2 accumulated in the past as well. At the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, hoping to create progressive innovation from Japan, we launched Global Zero Emission Research Center, headed by Dr. Akira Yoshino, who is last year's Nobel Prize laureate in chemistry, and working to implement the strategy. As part of that, from last week until tomorrow, we are having a Tokyo Beyond Zero Week. We are organizing 6 international conferences in the areas of energy and the environment to discuss, share, and disseminate challenges and methods with people around the world to realize Beyond Zero. One of them is the second TCFD Summit, where leaders of the world, financial and industrial communities were gathered for the meeting. Taking advantage of such an opportunity, about 300 Japanese companies boldly taking on the challenge of progressive environmental innovation were announced as zero-emission challenge companies and were introduced as examples of efforts made in Japan's private sector. Through the explanation of Climate Innovation Finance Strategy 2020, which was drafted last month, we sent a message to the world promoting financing to both transition towards decarbonization, low carbonization, and progressive innovation. Investors and companies having constructive dialogue and making public the outcome. I hope that A virtuous cycle of the environment and growth can be supported by the power of finance to brush up further the climate change countermeasures of companies. Through such programs, we will continue to strongly support further provision of financing into innovation. Toward the ultimate goal of a decarbonized world, we at the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry want to work hand in hand with you and work boldly to realize a virtuous cycle of the environment and growth. Let me conclude by wishing that this summit will trigger further discussion on world climate change response. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ejima. Next is Mr. Satoshi Nakanishi, Parliamentary Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs. Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction. Satoshi Nakanishi, Parliamentary Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs. Thank you for the kind invitation to Japan Climate Action Summit 2020. Due to the novel coronavirus, this is held online this year, but to see so many participants from across the country with shared firm determination to resolve climate change challenges is a great pleasure. In order to realize a sustainable society, the SDGs aim to resolve issues from mid- and long-term perspectives. But these goals are becoming increasingly important in order to recover after the pandemic. Under the belief of human security, the philosophy of the SDGs is to leave no one behind. And climate change is one of the core issues. This year is the first year of the decade of action. Japan and the world are now expected to transform our societies. COP26, which was planned for this year in the UK, had to be postponed inevitably to November 2021. However, this year, 2020, is a critical year as a full-scope implementation and the submission of reduction targets are required under the Paris Agreement. Japan is proactively organizing or participating in online climate related to international events and is deeply engaged in the global effort to counter climate changes. In January next year, the first ever climate change policy competition targeting the youth will be organized by the Foreign Ministry. As we envision the post-corona world, how to allow the economy to grow, but to maintain sustainable global environment at the same time is only becoming more critical. By promoting global cooperation under the Paris Agreement and by mastering all available wisdom and by pursuing innovations, we should be able to realize a decarbonized world. This determination of Japan stands unwaveringly firm. The government of Japan finds the collaboration and cooperation of people of diverse positions indispensable. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs will work together with all of you here today to lead the endeavor of the global community as we move forward towards the November next year COP26. Thank you, Mr. Nakanishi.
Next, from the FSA, Mr. Satoshi Ikeda, Chief Sustainable Finance Officer from the FSA. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm Chief Sustainable Finance Officer at the FSA. My name is Ikeda. Climate Action Summit Japan, JCAS, being organized despite COVID-19. I would like to congratulate for this organization, and I would like to express my respect to persons involved. The FSA is a supervisory authority on finance, and as you know, world's supervisors are closely watching at the risks brought by climate change from a standpoint of financial stability. We have been having that kind of discussion eagerly. Network for Greening the Financial System, NGFS, this is participated by central banks and supervisors. This is a voluntary network, and the FSA and the BOJ have participated in this network. So within the supervisors, how can we integrate climate change risk, how that could be integrated into supervision activities. That is being contemplated. I was invited to this summit last year, and compared to what it was like 1 year ago, the content of discussion has progressed so much. Last year, NGFS on financial risk and climate change as a general matter, how could we integrate that in financial supervisory monitoring? That was being proposed, but within the space of just 1 year, how that is to be integrated, specifically how do we go about doing that? For supervisors, there has been guidance to financial institutions, or more recently, climate change with its uncertainties. When you want to assess such a risk, scenario analysis would be needed. That is, to various scenarios, we check whether full preparations has been made. We have decided that that needs to be validated. And from a perspective of financial regulators, financial institutions, when they conduct a scenario analysis of climate change, we provide guidance for such scenario analysis, and specific scenarios are also in concrete fashion. NGFS has organized those scenarios and made them public. GDP data is part of that scenario, and what would happen to energy consumption, or what about grain production levels, or natural disasters and other climate change physical impacts, bringing or about what kind of events. This is a comprehensive package of data that will be needed for such an analysis, and the financial supervisory regulators would compile them together, and we made them available in June. Primarily, it is the financial supervisors. When asking financial institutions to conduct scenario analysis, we ask them to use this. But as part of TCFD, many business corporations are now having difficulty deciding how scenario analysis should be conducted. So in such attempts, this could be one of the useful resources. So around the globe, such scenario analyses are being promoted by financial regulators, and at the Japan FSA, to large financial institutions, we hope to ask them to continue with such analysis, and at the same time, in conducting such scenario analysis, there needs to be two types of collaboration. One is when you have a concrete scenario. I've talked about data having been developed, and currently, this is a global-based data, but how can you inject Japanese data to that data set is going to be the next challenge. People in the academia, researchers, we want to coordinate with such people to do that work. Next thing, when you conduct this scenario analysis, usually it's referred to as stress testing. So financial institutions, how much capital do they have to be resilient against the losses? That is how it is usually looked at. But in 2050 or up to 2100, scenarios are prepared. So in responding to such scenarios, it's not just a matter of boosting financial institutions' capital. Financial institutions alone cannot prepare sufficiently to climate change, and therefore sustainable finance must be promoted at the same time. So such work is being promoted by the Financial Services Agency of Japan. So all of you gathered here, and those of you participating over the internet, we hope to collaborate with all of you. So thank you very much for your support. And with this, I would like to conclude my remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ikeda. Thank you very much to all the leaders from the respective government authorities, despite your busy schedule. Now, 8 a.m. in London, our speaker of last year as well, we have Mr. Nigel Topping joining us. The title is COP26 High-Level Climate Champion, So the presidency from the UK, from COP26, he will tell us about what all the stakeholders are doing, including industry, investors, and local government authorities, and he is the coordinator to strengthen the collaboration. So we will hear about the Race to Zero campaign towards COP26 and this message to Japan. Just in case, once again, about the interpretation function, Mr. Topping will speak in English. Should you need a translation, please find the translation mark at the bottom of Zoom. Mr. Topping, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning from the UK, good afternoon in Japan. I'm really sorry I can't be with you this year like last year. Thank you to the Japan Climate Leadership Initiative for all the work that you're doing to promote leadership on climate change. And thank you, Take, for your wonderful remarks earlier, which will allow me to be a bit briefer. I want to start just by reiterating what you've already heard, that the zero carbon economy is inevitable. And this is increasingly a matter of urgency. It's urgent for society, and it's urgent for business. It's a matter of competitiveness and survival. Why do I say that? You know, the science was already very clear that for every 0.1 of a degree and for every year that we miss the targets of net zero before 2050, there is massive human suffering and economic damage. Scientists will start the next round of their IPCC reports before COP26, and they will show an assessment of risk which shows that the impact of 1.5 degrees is higher than previously thought. That's why scientists are starting to look scared, and our children are increasingly frightened, angry, frustrated with the lack of progress. Children who will become our employees and who will vote for future governments. But it's also a matter of urgency for businesses because the technology is changing so fast. You know all the examples. And in every sector now, we have a pathway to zero. And we have leading companies who've committed to net zero by 2050 in shipping, Maersk, in cement, Lafarge-Holcim, in trucking, Mercedes. And increasingly, policymakers are catching up in the EU, in the UK. Maybe if there's a change of president in the USA, there'll be a significant change in climate policy. And of course, most importantly, recently in China, now committed to full decarbonization in the 2050s. And in my role as high-level champion, I am tasked by the United Nations Climate Convention parties to work with businesses, cities, investors, civil society to raise our ambition and to accelerate action. And that's why we launched in June, Gonzalo Munoz, my fellow champion, and I, the Race to Zero, inviting companies, investors, cities, regions, schools, universities, everybody to join the Race to Zero by committing to their own goal of getting to zero before 2050 and having a concrete plan for the next 5 or 10 years of what they're going to do to get there. Already we've seen more than double of the numbers since a year ago. We have over 1,100 companies, 500 cities, $5 trillion of assets under management. And with all the cities and regions, we have over 2.6 billion people, that's a third of the world's population, living somewhere that is covered by a net zero goal. But most importantly, I wanted to talk about how this change happens. And this goes to the point of scenarios that our previous speaker was describing. This change does not happen in a straight line. Every single industrial transformation that has ever happened has happened exponentially. It starts very slowly, and then it goes exponential, and then suddenly the world's changed. If you look at the transformation from horse-drawn carriages to cars, or from valves to transistors, from analog film to digital film, from every sector that's ever gone through a transformation, it has surprised the incumbents with its pace. And some of the incumbents have died, and some of the disruptors have become the new leaders of the world. Japan in the 1970s is a great example of the vision and leadership to see such a disruption and win. In the first oil crises in the 70s, Japanese industry, Japanese manufacturers organized themselves and were very clear. That's why Toyota is the most important car company in the world now, although maybe Elon Musk would argue with that. That took leadership and courage from industry, from government, from the whole of society. But now, Japan is not leading on its thinking and its policy on climate change. It's lagging the UK, the EU, California, South Korea, China, and many other countries that have put a very clear end date on the journey to net zero. And of course, next year, the world's eyes will be on Japan, particularly when you host the Olympic Games, but also in the run-up to COP26, to see whether Japan is going to continue to be outside of that leading group or join it. So I would, first of all, I know most of you watching are already in the Race to Zero, you're in the JCI, and you're very committed. I would urge you, let's get every Japanese business to join the Race to Zero. Let's get every Japanese investor and city to join with C40 and ICLEI and all of our partners in the Race to Zero to make their own very clear plans. That will help your government to be more courageous. On the 12th of December this year, government leaders will meet on the 5th anniversary of the historic Paris Agreement to share their ambition for a clean, prosperous world. That event's convened by the UK Prime Minister and the United Nations Secretary General. I hope that your new Prime Minister Suga will join those leaders in making clear Japan's commitment to get to net zero by 2050, or perhaps earlier. Perhaps you could join California and commit to net zero by 2045. And of course, that will mean a strengthening of your plans for 2030. As I know, many Japanese businesses have been calling for a significant increase in renewable energy ambition and an absolutely clear end to coal financing. Japan faces a choice. In the 1970s, faced with the global energy crisis, Japan chose to win. I'm encouraged by what I hear from the minister from METI about innovation and opportunity and the virtuous circle, but I was waiting to hear the date and I didn't hear it. So I'm still waiting. Japan is now faced with a bigger and more predictable transformation as a result of this inevitable change faced with the crisis of climate catastrophe. But it seems to me that Japan as a society has not yet chosen whether it's going to be a winner or a loser. Time is running out. So thank you for all your leadership. I wish you good luck. Let's get everybody to join the Race to Zero. And I hope to see your Prime Minister standing up on the 12th of December, joining the most ambitious leaders in the world in committing to making this transition a reality for everybody. Thank you.
はい、今こそ日本も変わるチャンス。
Japan is now having an opportunity to change. There's a lot of expectation for Japan. Thank you very much to Mr. Topping joining us from London. This Race to Zero at JCI, we are the contact point in Japan. We would like to support participation into Race to Zero as we solicit members I just would like to ask you to stand at the start line together for this race.